do this and just mention that this is a paper written with Sophie and Adrien, who are also at Banque de France, but the three of us do not add up to Banque de France, so the usual disclaimer apply. These are our views and not necessarily the ones of Banque de France or the Eurosystem. So as I just said, it's a paper on monetary policy gradualism and monetary policy under uncertainty. So in a way, motivating it is fairly easy. We've been living very uncertain times in the past year or two, and various metrics of uncertainty are at an all-time high. And when you think that times are not uncertain, then you discover about a new variant, etc., etc. At the same time, I want to both broaden and narrow the scope of this paper. It's not going to be a paper specifically about monetary policy in pandemic times or even in crisis time, but more about the general uncertainty faced by monetary policy. Actually, we started this paper, as it will become clear, just before the COVID crisis, based on the situation in the euro area at the time. And as a matter of fact, central banks must set monetary policy under substantial uncertainty all the time, not only in crisis time. They face a lot of uncertainty on the economic outlook and also on the effect of their own policy. So you might be uncertain of the effect of an interest rate cut on inflation, of the effect of QE, of the effect of forward guidance, etc., etc. There's actually a famous quote by Alan Greenspan when he was still chairman of the Federal Reserve, in which he says that uncertainty is not just an important feature of the monetary policy landscape, it is the defining characteristic of that landscape. It was true in 2003, and it's still the case today when the main question in every central banker's mind is whether the current inflation will prove persistent or not. Okay, so uncertainty is an important feature of monetary policy. And to this uncertainty, many central banks often react by attenuating their policy response or changing it only gradually. And to justify it, they often refer to to a paper that Brainard wrote some 50 years ago, and which came to be known as Brainard's attenuation principle. So if you don't know about Brainard's attenuation principle, it may seem a bit obvious. It sounds a bit like an old advice that if you don't know, you should be careful. But actually what Brainard showed is that it's more subtle than this. In particular, it's not a conclusion that you can draw from any types of uncertainty. I distinguish between two types of uncertainty at the top of the slide, between uncertainty on the economic outlook and uncertainty on the effect of the policies that you implement. And what Brainard showed in his paper is that only the second type of uncertainty justifies attenuation and gradualism. Okay, so I will come back amply to why this is the case during the presentation, but for the moment, to just get the insight and the intuition, you can just think of it this way. If you are uncertain of the effect of your action, then the more you move, the more you're going to create uncertainty. And if you are risk averse, if you don't like this uncertainty, you want to minimize this uncertainty that just acting creates. Okay. So this Brainard principle is an issue that hasn't attracted a lot of economic research in the recent years, but that's something that was very much discussed in policy circle and in the academic literature at the end of the 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, especially when Alan Blinder made it widely known to central bankers. In his book on his experience as a central banker, he writes that this Brainard principle was never far from his mind when he occupied the vice chairman's office at the Federal Reserve. And in his view, as both a citizen and a policymaker, a little stodginess at the central bank is entirely appropriate. And since then, that's really something that's come back very often in central bankers' way of thinking, which you can find back in their policy speeches. So for instance, Jay Powell in 2018 summed up the Brainard principle in this clever formula, saying that when you are unsure of the potency of a medicine, then you should start with a somewhat smaller dose of it. You also see references to this principle in Bernanke speeches, in Carney speeches at the Bank of England, etc. Or again, Williams in 2013, in the context of unconventional monetary policies, made the case that when you are using instruments on which you have very little knowledge about their effects, you should use a smaller dose of it. You should apply this Brainard principle.
So Stephane, can I make
Yeah.
a very general question? I'm not sure if it is a good question, but shouldn't a similar principle be a concern also in many other situations? I don't know, medicine, education, I mean, all sorts of experiments. Why so specific the Brainard principle to monetary policy?
So you're absolutely right, especially about the fact that this is a very general principle. In Brainard's original paper, is not at all specifically concerned about monetary policy. So he's an economist, and he has more in mind fiscal, monetary policy, things you usually associate economics with. But his principle is very general, and he wants it to be general. The point of our paper, I'm going to come at it just in one slide, is that that's precisely when you apply this Brainard principle to monetary policy, then you should be careful. So your question is actually extremely relevant. That's going to be the precise points of our paper. Let me just mention one thing on the...
A very general question.
Sure, go ahead.
So I guess that what's on these people's head is that the effect is somehow linear, right? But if you have a policy that has a very non-linear effect, it might be that with a very little bit of the policy, you get no effect. And if you implement a larger policy, you start seeing the effects. Is that something that has been discussed?
You're right. That would be another argument to question to either argue for the Brainard principle or to argue against it. As I'm going to mention, there are many actually arguments that have been made against this Brainard principle, at least showing cases in which, well, maybe actually you don't want to take it for granted. What we are going to do here is to place ourselves in a situation in which it perfectly applies. And we are going to see, be careful, if you apply it to monetary policy, there's going to be a specific thing, which is going to be the reaction of inflation expectations that is going to qualify how much you want to rely on this. So we're going to place ourselves very much in the Brainard framework, except for everything that is specific to monetary policy, this endogenous reaction of inflation expectation, but everything will be linear, everything will be very, very much like in the original argument. So let me go. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, one question. Here, like by the quotes that the policymaker quotes, I think they talk more about graduality than attenuation. And I don't know if you make the difference within the Brainard principle, that is act less, and all these guys still act slowly. I don't know if it's equivalent or not.
Absolutely. So you're absolutely right that we are not going to make it, basically because this Brainard principle is actually not in itself, in its original form, it's not about gradualism. It's about actually attenuation. You're absolutely right that in policy speeches, central bankers tend to more make a case about gradualism. But then they rely and they refer to this Brainard principle, which is not originally and technically about gradualism. So there are two ways to treat that. Either they are a bit sloppy in the way they use the argument, or they have another argument in mind in which you would do some wait and see. So let me answer your question very simply and very clearly. It's going to be about attenuation. It's not going to be, strictly speaking, about gradualism in this paper, because the Brainard principle is not, strictly speaking, about gradualism. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And one other thing, like the Powell quote, I think he was the one of the medicine stuff.
Yep.
That will mean that variance, he will be thinking that the variance of the instrument is a function of experiments. So it wouldn't be a constant. So by making, I think he will say that by making small experiment, you reduce the variance of the expected, and once you are sure of how it works, then you can do the big changes.
Absolutely, that would be, you're absolutely right. That would be a perfect example, because in the speech, that's the speech where he specifically discusses Brainard principle. So Brainard said that, and we should follow him. And then it sums it up in this way, which mixes actually two arguments. One, which is literally the Brainard argument, that you should do less when you're unsure of the effect of your medicine. But there is this start with a somewhat smaller dose, which start to introduce this, well, let's do it, let's learn and wait and see, which is not actually what Brainard is initially about. But you're absolutely right that the distinction is important, and it's not made usually in those policy speeches.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, so let me actually, I mean, it will be very clear when hopefully, when I get to the model that it's, we're going to abstract from all the dynamics of learning that you could add to this reasoning. Okay, so yes, just to mention the original motivation of this paper, and the reason why we want to focus on this is because it seems that it's something that came a lot in central banker speeches, especially in the euro area. And just before the COVID, you had, for instance, this quote by Mario Draghi during a press conference that specifically uses this argument to explain why the ECB was not doing more, acting more than you would expect. So it was in March 2019, which seems like an eternity ago. So let me just remind you a bit what the context was at the time. There was some bad data for the economic outlook at the time, and it wasn't sure whether it was a soft patch or something more sustainable. So there was several questions during the Q&A asking Mario Draghi, well, you're saying that the outlook is deteriorating, but you're not actually changing your policy much. So what is going on? And Mario Draghi answered, well, you do what you think is right, and you temper, however, with what you are doing with the consideration there is uncertainty. In a dark room, you move with tiny steps. Explicitly this idea of attenuation, or here, as you just mentioned, gradualism. Okay, so let me enter precisely the topic of this paper and distinguish what Brainard said some 50 years ago from what we are going to say in this paper. As I mentioned, this Brainard principle is not specifically concerned with monetary policy. That's something which is intended as a very general principle. But we can apply it to monetary policy, and central bankers often apply it to monetary policy. So to be concrete, consider conventional interest rate policy, and we will focus on this in the paper. So just for concreteness, imagine that you have a deflationary shock, a shock that would decrease the natural rates of interest. So the Brainard principle, if you apply it to monetary policy, is going to tell you that if you are uncertain of the effect of your interest rate cut on inflation, then you should cut interest rates somewhat less. You know that inflation will probably fall a bit below your target in this case, but that's something you're fine with. Now, the point that we make in this paper is that there is a pitfall when you apply this argument to monetary policy. And the pitfall is that this argument abstracts from the reaction of the inflation expectation of the private sector. Those inflation expectations are a primary determinant of inflation, and they are likely to respond, if not today, at least after some time, to what the central bank is doing. And what we show in this paper is that the following thing can happen. Once or when the private sector realizes that the central bank is cutting interest rate less and that inflation falls below its targets, then it's going to form lower inflation expectations. This is going to push inflation further down, to which the central bank is going to be willing to react by cutting interest rate further down. And what we show is that the central bank can easily end up in a situation in which it cuts interest rates as much as it was initially reluctant to do, but with inflation which is further below target than it initially wanted. So this might ring a bell. This is actually a mechanism that shares some similarities with the inflation bias of Kydland and Prescott. In particular, it's really rooted in the reaction of the inflation expectations of the private sector. Let me stress right now that there is one important difference, though, which is that this inflation bias, this cautiousness bias, in contrast to the inflation bias, does not rely on the central bank wanting to set output above potential output. And actually, we're going to show all the results in the case of a central bank that cares only about inflation, a central bank that doesn't have a dual mandate like the Fed. So that will apply equally to the ECB, which has a primary mandate of price stability, and as far as I know, also to the Banco Central de Chile, which also has, from what I could get from the website, only a primary mandate of inflation, at least nothing related to output stabilization in its mandate. Now, the ECB and the Banco de Chile might actually have very different attitudes toward gradualism and attenuation, but that's a distinct thing. Okay, so let me just come back to the motivation with the euro area, because we really think that for the euro area, this application of this Brainard principle and this what we call the cautiousness bias and this mechanism that we want to stress in this paper is something that may be really at play in the euro area, not only because of what you observe, but also because that's something that has actually been theorized by the ECB. Because it's not the case that the ECB is always gradual in its policy setting. In some instances, it's actually act in a very bold and decisive way. For instance, when the ECB announced the start of quantitative easing in 2015, it justified it specifically, mentioning that it required a very forceful and immediate action, and that it was implementing it because it saw that the long-term inflation expectation were showing sign of de-anchoring. So this is what the Governing Council said at the time. It said that it took this decision in a situation in which most indicators of actual and expected inflation in the euro area had drifted toward their historical lows, and that this situation required a forceful monetary policy response. And this is exactly what we are going to show in the model. The central bank, if it cares about inflation uncertainty in this Brainard way, might end up in a situation where it wants to attenuate its policy. Then it has a consequence on the inflation expectation of the private sector. And that when it realizes this, then it wants to act more than it would initially have had to do.
Stephane?
Yeah.
Question. So the idea is that, in general, just in order to make sure that I understand, is that the central bank doesn't know like how much his decision will affect inflation at the end, and
exactly.
that's why it's gonna, like, you know, they cut rates less that it would otherwise know.
Absolutely, you're going to have some uncertainty. It's going to be parameter uncertainty. I think I'm delaying entering the model a bit too much, but it's going to be right here in the next slide. So
the issue is about, just last question to understand. So there's an asymmetry of information between the central bank and the agents, or is it uncertainty for everybody, or, you know?
So we are going to focus only on uncertainty on the side of the policymakers. We're gonna, since it's not the Brainard argument and it's not in the original paper by Brainard, we're going to abstract from uncertainty on the side of the private sector. It will be only the policymaker, only the central bank.
Thanks.
Let me just go quickly on the slide. That was just to mention that, well, when we think about uncertainty, we nowadays obviously think about COVID. Just to mention here that this paper is not really about the kind of reaction that central bank had in response to the COVID crisis. You could actually see some moves by the ECB at the beginning of the COVID crisis that looked a bit like initially you don't do much, and then when you start saying that, for instance, spreads in 1,000 countries in the euro area start increasing, then you start the PEP, which was the new QE program in the euro area. So it looks a bit like this, but obviously the model is not at all capturing this kind of mechanism. There's nothing about sovereign debt. There's nothing about default risk in this model. Now, this model may be capturing, though, a situation to which we have already returned a couple of months after the peak of the pandemic, and right now that the question has become more related to normal times monetary policy.
Sorry, Stephane. I think I read in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, Ricardo Reis' review on monetary policy, and he provided a related but sort of different argument. He was saying that since empirical analysis shows monetary policy works with a long lag, right? It works after 14 months or something like that. Then that should be a prescription for sometimes acting more aggressively, right? Because you know the effect is only going to come up much later. So I was wondering if you thought about that.
Right. So many thanks for the question. So specifically, the delays of implementation of monetary policy is not something that that is so much discussed in this literature. But let me jump actually right now to the literature review slide. There are actually many arguments, as I mentioned, that try to qualify this argument to Brainard, usually in different ways. So this would be all those papers for the three first bullet points are related to this Brainard argument. So some of them just find again this Brainard principle in different contexts and different models, and some of them try to qualify them, just like with the argument that you use, but usually even remaining within the set of arguments of monetary policy uncertainty, saying that in some cases, if you don't know, especially if you model uncertainty with robust control instead, then you might want to act more. Your argument could be one that you would use in order to act more. That would be a different argument, I suppose. On this, I just want to mention that we want to actually try to make sense of what central bankers say and think when they use this argument, when they say, actually, we're going to be cautious, like Mario Draghi says when he say we should move with tiny steps because we are in a dark room. So we are going to really consider a model in which this would apply. And what we are going to show is just that, well, actually, you need to be careful, because even then, when all the planets are aligned and you really think that this Brainard principle should apply, then you still might be overly cautious. But obviously, you can add all the arguments, like the one you mentioned, that actually there are also other reasons why you want to act quickly. I mentioned some other here. There are, well, here I mentioned some arguments that are more distinct arguments in favor of gradualism. So there are many arguments that can go in either direction. The one you mentioned would be in favor of being more aggressive. You could be also more gradual because of financial stability reasons. You want to move interest rate less. You might care about hysteresis in the labor market, in which case you want to be more gradual. There are several arguments, and we need to weigh them at the end of the day.
Stephane?
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Hi. Can I ask you a question before you jump into the model? Just to see if I'm understanding the mechanism. Well, you haven't mentioned much about the mechanism. You did say that this effect goes through the anchoring, right? But what I'm trying to understand is how is that related to the public having a different information set than the central bank, and that being responsible for the market or the public perceiving as if the bank is not acting as firmly as it should act. So my question is, how much of the mechanism that you're gonna have in the model has to do with this, with the information set that the market has being different than what the bank has?
Right. Let me try to answer this right now before entering the model. You're right. So so I need to be careful, because we haven't done it with a symmetric information set for the private sector and the central bank. But the way the mechanism works, it's not related to the asymmetry of information. The asymmetry of information will not actually be on the state of the economy or anything. It will just be an asymmetry in terms of parameter uncertainty. Just to be actually just for commodity, and because it makes things easier, we will take the usual equation for the private sector, assuming implicitly that they know the parameter of the model. But it's really not key in terms of knowledge and information about the state of the world. There will be no asymmetry of information between the central bank and the private sector. And basically, that's just an assumption we make for convenience. Now, I haven't done it getting rid of this asymmetry because it would make things a bit more complicated. But hopefully, from the logic of the mechanism, you will see that it's not rooted in the asymmetry between the two.
Okay, thank you.
Let me come back to this. I mean, you can ask me once you see it if you suspect that it's driven by this. My understanding of the model is that it's really orthogonal to this issue. As you can see, here is the model. Actually, we're gonna actually show this bias in various specification of the Phillips curve. That's the way that I'm going to present it to you today. But we want to start with the simplest model in which it's going to show up. So it's going to be the simplest model you can think of. We're going to have a Euler equation on the demand side and a very simple Phillips curve on the supply side, which is the new classical Phillips curve. So this is this one, the same as in Lucas 72, in which the inflation expectation are expectations of inflation today formed in the previous period. And what I mean when I say that the private sector doesn't face model uncertainty, contrary to the central bank, is just that we take those two equations as given, as usually derived in the model with no model uncertainty. So that's just what we mean here, and we just do it for convenience. Now, the only things that we had in this very simple model is that the central bank is going to be uncertain of the value of the parameter sigma, which is the intertemporal elasticity of substitution in the Euler equation. So it doesn't know its value. It only has a prior, which has a mean sigma bar and a variance V of sigma. And this is what will introduce model uncertainty. We do it this way because that's the way Brainard does it in his original paper. Okay, so just a couple of remarks. This one, we already discussed it. The private sectors know sigma and face no model uncertainty implicitly. Just for this, we will need to distinguish between the expectation of the central bank and the private sector. So from now on, whenever I use a star, those are the expectations of the central bank. When I use no star, this is the expectation of the private sector. Last remark, notice that I put the uncertainty on the parameter sigma, but there's also another parameter, which is the slope of the Phillips curve kappa. The reason we do it is just because this is the case which is more favorable to the Brainard principle. It turns out that if you have uncertainty on both, you can end up in a situation in which you have a covariance term that can actually attenuate or even revert the result of policy attenuation. That's something that is already discussed in Brainard's paper. We want to abstract from all those other reasons that would qualify the Brainard principle. So we consider this case, which is the most favorable one to monetary policy attenuation. Okay, so I've shown you all of the model. I just need to tell you what's the objective of the central bank is. And here it is. That's a very simple objective. The central bank cares about the quadratic departures of inflation from its target pi star. And the central bank just chooses a path for inflation, the output gap, and the nominal interest rates in order to minimize this loss. Just one remark, we are not going to be interested in monetary policy implementation, no Taylor rule, nothing like this. So we can, it's just a change of variable, we can just use the real interest rate instead of the nominal interest rate. Since it's more convenient, we're going to do everything with the real interest rate instead. Obviously, this has an implication for the nominal interest rate, and we can recover it when we are interested in it. Second remark, which I mentioned already, is that this objective is only about inflation. There's no dual mandate. The central bank does not care about the output gap and stabilizing the output gap. We do this for two reasons. The first one is the one that I mentioned in the introduction, is that we want to emphasize this is very distinct from the inflation bias of Kinnon and Prescott. It applies even if you have a single inflation mandate. But there is also a second reason, which is that, again, we want to stay as close as possible to Brainard's original framework. And Brainard, in his paper, considers a policymaker with a single instrument. It will be the real interest rate here, and a single objective. So if we only take inflation, then we fit exactly into Brainard's original setup. And let me show it to you right now. This, at the top of the slide, is the setup that Brainard's consider. So he's not specifically concerned about monetary policy. It's very general, and he's saying, so imagine that you have a policy P, and an objective y that you want to set on a target y star. And you have this linear relationship between the two. Now, the key thing is that you have some uncertainty on the effect of your policy. So if this is A here, you don't know A, you only have a distribution of possible values for A. Now, let's show that this is exactly, the framework that we are considering is exactly equivalent to this one. To make this equivalence, you need to consider monetary policy under discretion. This cautiousness bias is going to be a feature of policy under discretion, and we will compare it later to the policy under commitment. So consider the policy under discretion so that the central bank is taking those inflation expectations as given. Define a couple of variables, especially this phi, which is the product of the elasticity of intertemporal substitution in the Euler equation and the slope of the Phillips curve. Because sigma is uncertain, this phi here is going to be uncertain as well. And you can easily show that the program of the central bank under discretion is equivalent to choosing an interest rate R, a real interest rate, that minimizes the departure of inflation from the target pi star. So this is exactly the framework considered by Brainard, up to one exception, one difference, which is the presence of those inflation expectations that come from the Phillips curve. Otherwise, everything is exactly the same. So if you do not endogenize the inflation expectations of the private sector, then you can fall exactly on the Brainard result. And this is, it seems to be what central bankers do when they rely on this Brainard principle to justify attenuating policy. So I'm going to fix those inflation expectations to make it explicit. I'm going to denote them with this lowercase e of pi to emphasize that we do not endogenize them for the moment. So the best way to understand this Brainard principle is to decompose the loss function between the squared mean deviation from target and the variance of inflation. When you see it this way, it's as if the central bank has two objectives, one of setting its best expectation of inflation on target, and one of minimizing the variance of inflation, the uncertainty on inflation. If you are not uncertain about the model, then the second term disappears, and you want to do the policy RS here, which basically consists in tracking the natural rate. That's what we know about those simple models, at least when you only care about inflation stabilization, you want the real rate to track the natural rate of interest. And there is just a corrective term in case the inflation expectations are not on target. Now, when you do care about model uncertainty, you're going to have a second objective, which is to minimize your uncertainty on inflation. And the value that minimizes this uncertainty is going to be to set the real interest rate to its steady state value, which is 0 here. So you want, in the end, you arbitrate this trade-off by setting your real interest rate as a weighted average between this RS, the policy under certainty, and 0, which is the policy you would set if you cared only about uncertainty. And this parameter alpha here, you can show, is this function of the distribution of your belief on phi. So you see that if you have no uncertainty on phi, V of phi is 0, then alpha is 1. You behave as if you are certain. That makes sense. And as V of phi increases, you start attenuating policy more and more and responding less to changes in the natural rate. Okay, so just one remark is that when you behave in this way, the central bank does expect that inflation is not going to be on target. But it's not a bias for the moment in itself. It's just something that the central bank is willing to accept just in order to face less uncertainty on inflation. It sees it as a cost worth paying in order to minimize this uncertainty about inflation. But, and that's the point of this paper, the conclusion that you should attenuate policy is premature at the moment because we haven't endogenized the inflation expectation of the private sector. And in this model with rational expectation, those expectations are an endogenous outcome of the model, and you can solve for them, in which case you find the following expression, that the private sector expects inflation to be on target up to this corrective term. So you see that whenever alpha is less than 1, whenever the central bank cares about model uncertainty, you're going to have a departure of inflation expectation from target. For instance, imagine that the natural rate has fallen, and this has been foreseen by the private sector. In this case, the private sector is going to foresee that the central bank is going to attenuate policy so that inflation is going to be below target, and it's going to form lower inflation expectation. So negative natural rate shock foreseen by the private sector, you have lower inflation expectations. So whenever shocks are foreseen by the private sector, inflation expectations are not on target. Now, consequence of this, and that's this proposition 1, when you set monetary policy under discretion, the real interest rate in equilibrium takes the following expression. And you see that whenever the shocks are foreseen by the private sector, this alpha parameter here is going to completely disappear. So if you're able to fool the private sector, you can attenuate policy and you can implement a real interest rate that is different from the natural rate. But if this is foreseen, then the private sector is going to expect lower inflation expectation, which is going to decrease inflation, to which the central bank is going to be willing to decrease interest rates further down. And in the end, in equilibrium, you end up in a situation in which the central bank neither has its cake nor eat it. It's not able to attenuate the decrease in the real interest rate, and it has an inflation rate which is not on target. So let me just show you the second part, which is that even though the real interest rate is the same, inflation does not take the same value as if you did not care about model uncertainty. This is the expression for inflation. And you see that this red term appears whenever the shock on the natural rate is foreseen by the private sector. So in the second line here, this is the departure of inflation from its target that the central bank initially expects and is willing to tolerate. But when the shocks are foreseen, inflation is further below target than the central bank expected, and this creates this bias on inflation. So this leads us to proposition 2, which is explicitly this cautiousness bias. What the proposition on the slide adds is that this departure of inflation from what the central bank initially expected is not something optimal. You can solve for the optimal monetary policy under commitment, and you can show that this is not something that the central bank would like to do. So the discretionary policy always departs from the optimal policy under commitment, and it departs from its in the systematic way that the discretionary policy is overly cautious. So this is what we are going to call the cautiousness bias. Okay, so a slide on what the central bank can do in order to guard itself against this cautiousness bias. So one thing would be to just set monetary policy under commitment, but of course we want to abstract from this possibility. So in the spirit of one solution proposed to the inflation bias, the one proposed by Rogoff, we want to see if you can find a solution in appointing a central bankers who discounts the concern over uncertainty. So we do it in the following way. Instead of having this loss function, imagine that you appoint a central banker that discounts all those concerns, all this variance term in the loss function. And what you can show is that unless all the shocks are unforeseen by the private sector, then you should always appoint a central banker with a delta which is less than 1. You should always appoint someone who discounts those concerns over uncertainty. And the more the shocks are foreseen by the private sector, the lower the value of delta, the more you want to completely discount those concerns over uncertainty. So let me just mention a few things about the interpretation of this delta. You can interpret it in different ways. One way is to be very literal and to say you want to appoint a central banker that is very foolhardy, that very trusts his model, even though he should be aware that there is some uncertainty in the model presented by his staff. That's a literal interpretation, but you can also interpret it as saying that you should appoint a central banker that is less risk averse than society. Let's say well, there is some uncertainty on the effect of a policy, but I don't care. Finally, and maybe that's the interpretation we are most interested in, is to say that you should appoint a central bankers that consciously discounts all those uncertainty concerns. In which way it's a form of limited commitment, but we kind of solve the inflation bias problem with this kind of solution, and maybe we should do the same when it comes to concern over uncertainty. Okay, so this is for
Stephane?
Yeah.
I have a question regarding the attenuation, because you could maybe make the same argument or even use the same model for a central banker. There is too reactive, and instead of moving too slowly, is moving too fast, so creating like higher risk in the economy with higher inflation volatility than otherwise a more cautious central banker.
Right. You mean that if in a model in which you would have a rationale for being more aggressive, you could have the same bias that would say actually don't be too aggressive?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Like instead of moving, then you would have to undo what you just did like 2 years ago, something like that.
Right. No, that's very you're absolutely right. That's very possible. That in principle you can the reaction of the inflation expectation of the private sector can yield the same kind of conclusion with different mechanisms. The reason why we focus on this case where initially the central banker wants to attenuate policy is because it seems to be what central bankers most often refer to in their speeches. They say, well, we should be gradual, we should attenuate. So we take it from what they say, their policy speeches, and we try to make sense of it within a model. So we use a model in which they initially want to attenuate policy. But you're absolutely right that in a model in which you would like to be actually more aggressive, the same kind of mechanism could definitely apply.
Yeah, so I would think it would be interesting to like weigh the dangers of being overly cautious or overly risky. I know there's like a threshold that you don't want to cross. Like, okay, we're being too cautious because we don't want to be too risky, or we're being cautious because we don't know the outlook and the reaction. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying.
You mean having all the arguments? Yeah, that's no, definitely. I mean, I would say it's beyond the scope of this paper. We mentioned many arguments that can go in either direction. So that's not something we consider in the paper, but obviously, I mean, if we take, for instance, the current situation about, whether central banks need to act or not, obviously there are many arguments that are orthogonal, even unrelated to uncertainty. Maybe you want to, maybe it was a good idea to commit to a lower for longer monetary policy because of DLB, etc. And all this should obviously be factoring. We didn't try to factor in all these arguments and to try to see how this would affect the threshold. But that's definitely at the end of the day, that's the question that matters, right?
Stephane?
Yeah.
I think it's a bit related with what Mario said, but I mean, a long time ago when I was reading about the argument for the Taylor rule to have a lag term, one idea that how to rationalize it was the idea that central bankers have an aversion to backtrack. So they don't want to move too fast because they don't want to look like a fool tomorrow saying, oh, I make a mistake and I want to backtrack. And the idea of that was precisely that making too many obvious mistakes, in quotes, will make them lose credibility. And that will be like maybe an argument that you don't want to be, you want the attenuation because if there's uncertainty about how the instrument works, you will make too many mistakes if you don't attenuate, and that will in turn affect your ability to commit and the ability to anchor expectations.
Right. So let me answer in two parts. On the first point, that's a relevant argument. I would say, I mean, in the model as it is, you do make mistake. In the end, you look a bit. I mean, the private sector does see that you're actually not delivering, and this is your mistake that kind of are turned against you. So I guess you could make the argument both ways. But second point on the on adding lagged inflation in the Phillips curve, which was your initial remark, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you have optimal policy, but the idea behind that was that the loss function of the central bank has an aversion to backtrack, to move up, and then the next period have to move back down.
So interest rates. So interest rate smoothing.
Yeah,
kind of thing. Yeah, that's absolutely that's a different argument for this. In the end, uncertainty is giving you one reason for doing interest rate smoothing. So if you have this different argument, the same would apply even if your argument for doing interest rate smoothing is not uncertainty, but this kind of things. So in this case, you should be equally careful. You would have the same bias that if you do this and you do it under discretion, then you're gonna overdo it. Even though you might want to do it a bit, you should be careful. So that would apply
additive to whatever you're showing.
Sorry?
So it should be an additive bias to your model.
Absolutely. You can apply the same. It would have a different name, I guess, but that would be the same mechanism. Let me actually switch to something related to this idea of adding lagged inflation into the Phillips curve, but with a very different motivation. Because I presented you this cautiousness bias in the very simple model of the new classical Phillips curve, and it's good because it's easy and simple and it makes everything transparent, but it has some drawbacks. And in particular, one drawback is that with the new classical Phillips curve, everything happens in basically a one-period equilibrium. Everything is subsumed into a one-period game. And when we think about this cautiousness bias, we want more to tell a dynamic story. We want to say, well, first, the central bank attenuates its interest rate decrease. Because of this, then inflation is going to fall below target. Because of this, inflation expectations are going to decrease. So it's going to push inflation further down, to which the central bank is going to be willing to react by decreasing interest rate more, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't get these dynamics with the new classical Phillips curve, but we can get it if we change the Phillips curve to a Phillips curve with a richer dynamic. So what we're going to do here is to take the sticky information Phillips curve of Mankiw and Rice, which is this one here, and see whether we can get this dynamic story. So the sticky information Phillips curve is basically the same as the new classical Phillips curve, except that the inflation expectation are formed in the infinite past with a weighted average, so that it has a much richer dynamics for the reaction of inflation expectations. Okay, otherwise we want to keep the same model. Let me just mention one thing about the Euler equation, because there is one thing that actually matters. It's a bit technical, but in this model with uncertainty on parameters, it matters whether you take the iterated or the recursive Euler equation. In a model and the rational expectation, it's obviously equivalent, but here it matters. To understand why, define the long-term interest rates as this sum of the future short-term interest rates, and look at the iterated Euler equation. If you do so, you see that the output gap depends on the long-term interest rate R. And so the uncertainty on the effect of interest rates is uncertainty on the effect of the entire yield curve. But if you write it in the recursive way, then you're gonna make it appear as if the uncertainty bears only on the effect of the short-term interest rates. If the central bank observes the future output gap, you're gonna get that the central bank is only uncertain about the short-term interest rate. So both make sense, but we find that it's more natural to assume that you're uncertain about the effect of the entire yield curve on activity. So we are going to consider this case. Actually, if you do it with the recursive Euler equation, you get the same qualitative results, but not the same quantitative magnitude. Okay, so let me just show you this slide to mention that the general idea is the same with the sticky information Phillips curve. The trade-off of the central bank is the same, and it's going to respond to it in the same way qualitatively. It's going to attenuate its response under certainty by this coefficient alpha, which is the same as with the previous Phillips curve. Now it applies to the long-term interest rate. That's the only difference. And the other difference is that the inflation expectation that matters here are those much richer inflation expectations of the sticky information Phillips curve. But up to this, you get the same general idea, and you can show that inflation and the output gap solve this system, which is not a very transparent one. So let me just plot you impulse response function. To do so, I just need to tell you about the calibration that I'm going to use to do this. And so I'm going to plug an AR1 for the shock to the natural rate, and I'm going to calibrate the model in this standard way. The only thing which is new here is this alpha, the parameter of attenuation of monetary policy. And we're going to assume that the central bank attenuates the decrease in interest rates by 1/4. So there's going to be a fall in the natural rate of 100 basis points, and the central bank is going to attenuate it by 25 basis points initially. And this is what we get. So look first at the dashed red curves. The dashed red curves are what would happen if the inflation expectations of the private sector were to remain fixed. So you see, if you look at the real interest rate, that instead of tracking the natural rate in black, you would have instead a 55% attenuation, so that you would be on the dashed red curve for the real interest rate on the top right panel. But this is only if inflation expectations were to stay fixed. And this is roughly the case initially, because very few people notice the change in inflation at first. But gradually, those inflation expectations, if you look at the bottom left panel, start to adjust to the realization of inflation. The red curve is slowly converging to the blue curve. So that inflation is going to fall below targets, and inflation are going to fall below target as well. So that the central bank is going to be willing to decrease its interest rate further. So initially, the long-term interest rate on the top left panel, for instance, was very close to the red curve, which is the curve if inflation expectations don't react, but slowly it's going to converge to toward the black curve, which is the natural rate, the interest rate that would occur if the central bank were not concerned about inflation uncertainty. So you see that after a few quarters, the real interest rate, either the long-run interest rate or the short-term interest rate, actually are almost indistinguishable from the natural rate, and the central bank is not able to change the real interest rate. But inflation is not the same as if it did not try to attenuate policy, and you see that it falls further below target than the central bank initially expected in red. So you can just notice that the real interest rate never falls further below than the natural interest rate. But what you can see on the bottom right panel is that the nominal interest rate can fall below because inflation falls below target, which means that if you're concerned about the effective lower bound on nominal interest rate, you can end up in a situation in which, because you care about inflation uncertainty, you have to move nominal interest rate more. And if you have at some point a constraint because of the ZLB on nominal interest rate, you might end up at the ELB, even though you wouldn't have had to do so if you had decreased rates right at the beginning, and if you hadn't cared about inflation uncertainty. Okay, just notice here on the top right panel that actually there's really a big attenuation initially for the real interest rate. This is just because the private sector is expecting that tomorrow you're going to have to decrease interest rate a lot because you won't be able to decrease interest rate. So you face a very low yield curves tomorrow, so you don't want to attenuate interest rate much at the beginning. But otherwise, the sticky information Phillips curve tells you exactly the same story as with the new classical Phillips curve, except that it tells it in a dynamic way, which we think is a more realistic way of thinking about it. Okay, so let me just add a third Phillips curve, because it's still the case that the Phillips curve that we use most broadly in our models is the new Keynesian Phillips curve. So you might wonder, well, what about it? Does it still apply in this case? And this slice is about here. And basically, the conclusion is that, yes, it's still there with the new Keynesian Phillips curve, except that it shows up in a slightly different way. So if you take the new Keynesian Phillips curve with present expectation of future inflation, you can show that you have the cautiousness bias. You can even show this closed form solution. So here I'm assuming an AR1 for the shock to the natural rate. And under this assumption, you can have this expression for the long-term real interest rate. And you have two terms here in front of the long-term natural rate. The first one is this alpha parameter, the same as before, which is the desire by the central bank to attenuate interest rate changes. So this is the Brainard principle. But in red is the effect of the reaction of inflation expectation. And this is going to be a coefficient which is larger than 1. Alpha is less than 1. It's an attenuation parameter. And the red parameter, which is greater than 1, is going to attenuate the desire to attenuate. And in equilibrium, you cannot fully track your initial attenuation. If the shock is not persistent, then you're able to do it because inflation expectation can't react. But the more persistent the shocks are, the more the private sector is going to realize what's going on, and the less you're going to be able to make the real interest rate depart from the natural interest rate. So just notice that this is for the real interest rates on impact. So what you see here is that everything happens on impact. We don't have this dynamic story of the sticky information Phillips curve. That's quite expected, since we know that the new Keynesian Phillips curve has a very front-loaded dynamics. So in this sense, the new Keynesian Phillips curve resembles much more the new classical Phillips curve. But overall, regardless of the Phillips curve that you consider, you still have this cautiousness bias that shows up in one way or another.
Stephane?
Yeah.
One question. So I guess it's really interesting that that this appears, but I'm thinking about the generality of the result, like because you're trying different Phillips curves in order to probably in order to get for different expectation formation mechanism, right? So in which case would your result like continue, like if you take, like, I don't know, rational inattention, for example, or other types of formation expectation, would it still be the case that you get this? Do you know?
Right. So let me hand wave a bit. So we haven't done it with a different thing. In terms of rational inattention, my expectation would be that the sticky information Phillips curve captures it rather well, so that you would get something close to it. Under rational inattention, I would expect that. So basically, so you would probably not have this dynamic story necessarily. Some agents would never really care about this and would never really pay attention. So you would get something which is, so conceptually, which would be close to the case of the new classical Phillips curve, with shocks that are unforeseen by the private sector. So you could be in a situation in which you're able to attenuate policy because no one adjusts its inflation expectation much. In the end, regardless of the model that you use, what matters is how much agents end up adjusting their inflation expectations. So if you have agents that really don't pay attention to anything around them and never adjust their inflation expectations, then you can fool them, and you can the model reduces to a model without inflation expectations. What would be different though is if you have very backward-looking expectation, then this cautiousness bias would show up in exactly the same way. The dynamic would be different, you would, I mean, it would be a bit like the sticky information Phillips curve. Initially, you would be able to fool them, but when inflation falls, they would, that would feed into their inflation expectations. So it can be broad, but at some point, inflation expectation need to move for the mechanism to continue. Okay, so let me just stop throwing Phillips curve at you now, and just take a slide to just make a distinct point, which is that in all the specification that I've shown you so far, this cautiousness bias has always manifested itself as an overreaction bias. Inflation has been more volatile than it could have been, than it should have been, because of this cautiousness bias. But it has not affected the average level of inflation. If you average over all the values of the shocks to the natural rates, you end up with inflation on target. You have more volatile inflation, but no systematic bias. What I want to mention on this slide is that this is only due to an implicit assumption that we have made in the model, in all the models that I've shown you so far. And we can relax this assumption. And in this case, you can actually end up with a bias also on average inflation, just like there is a bias on average inflation with the inflation bias of Kydland and Prescott. So to make this generalization, we do the following. We are going to just subtract R bar minus one term here and add it back, except that we take the mean of the coefficient phi when we add it back. This means that on average, the reaction of the reaction of inflation to interest rate is going to be the same, but the volatility over inflation is going to be different. This time, the volatility of inflation, this var of phi, is going to be minimized for this arbitrary value R bar minus one. So it's not necessarily the steady state interest rate that minimizes the volatility of inflation. And what you can show in this case is that whenever this R bar minus one is different from 0, is not the steady state value, then you can end up with a systematic bias on inflation. So this is, again, another manifestation of this cautiousness bias. Imagine that the natural interest rate is 0.5 on average, which is consistent with main current estimates, but that the central bank is uncertain of the effect of interest rates on of the interest rate pass-through when interest rates are low. So that you would be more confident of the effect of interest rates when real interest rates are 2% and nominal interest rates are, let's say, 4 or 5%. In this case, it would have a systematic bias towards setting interest rate too high, in which case the central bank would have a systematic bias toward below target inflation. So this is what proposition 6 tells you. It tells you that this bias wouldn't be optimal. So regardless of the value of R bar minus 1, the optimal average inflation rate is always pi star. But if your R bar is different from 0, that's not the average inflation rate that you're going to implement. And you will have this cautiousness bias making you depart from target on average, and not only as an overreaction bias. Okay, so I just want to take a slide before concluding on unconventional policy. So everything I've shown you so far is about conventional interest rate policies, but obviously right now, monetary policy is very often mostly done with unconventional instruments as the marginal instrument. So what about unconventional policies? So maybe the first obvious remark, which I think I already mentioned, is that unconventional policies are likely to be the one whose effects are most uncertain, so are likely to be the one to which central bankers respond by being unwilling to act too much because they are uncertain of their effect. So it's all the more important to be aware of the cautiousness bias when it comes to those unconventional policies. The second remark that I wanted to make is something that I already mentioned, which is that actually this cautiousness bias can lead you to decrease nominal interest rate more than you would if you were not concerned about model uncertainty. So you can end up in a situation in which you fall up against the ELB, even though you wouldn't have to fall that low if you were not concerned about model uncertainty, meaning that you have to resort to unconventional policies, even though you wouldn't have if you were not concerned about this. And third, and that relates a bit to the discussion that we had before, obviously there are other arguments for gradualism. And maybe most importantly in the current context, I'm thinking of the argument for gradualism of Woodford 2003, which is basically the paper that makes the first case for price level targeting for makeup strategies. So the most obvious remark here is that this is a distinct argument, and one important aspect of it is that it does not rely on anything related to uncertainty. So it's not a reason to use less those unconventional policy, like forward guidance in this case, in an uncertain world. Actually, the Woodford argument would tell you that that's precisely when you are at the ELB and you're looking for new instrument that you should do so some lower for longer and that you should be gradual. That's an argument to do more of it and not less of it like you would. Okay, so let me just conclude now by maybe recalling what I mentioned a couple of times, which is that the literature on monetary policy under uncertainty has identified several cases in which the Brainard principle is not robust. You can find cases in which actually under specific parameterization or changing some assumption and some modeling details, you can find situations in which you want to be more aggressive. Here I want to refer to a sentence in Blinder's book on his experience as a central banker, in which he looks at those examples that are starting to appear and he says, my intuition tells me that this Brainard principle is more general, or at least more wise in the real world than the mathematics will support. So to conclude, I just want to mention that in this paper, we made a distinct qualification to this Brainard attenuation principle. So we don't want to say that uncertainty does not justify moving cautiously, but we want to say that central banks face a bias toward being overly cautious, and that it can be useful to be aware of this bias in order to guard yourself against it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephane. So let's see if there are questions. But while we wait, I can ask you something. So what you said in the previous slide, you said at the end that this makes move nominal rates more, right? So the cautious bias can lead central bank to move the nominal rates more. So if you have in your objective another objective that makes you want to move it less because of what Benjamin was saying, that you don't want to undo what you did, you don't want to look foolish, this would make this would decrease the problem, right? So it wouldn't be not so cautious, I guess.
So you're assuming that you have an objective to minimize the volatility of interest rates in your loss function, right? So
the nominal, right? Yeah.
If you want the nominal. In this case, so my expectation is that you would end up with the same problem. So you care about this, but you still have the structure of the economy that tells you, well, if you don't decrease real interest rates as much as the fall in the natural rate, inflation is going to depart from its target. And if you act under discretion and you don't internalize this fact, you're going to have exactly the same problem. So you're going to say, well, maybe the natural rate is falling, but I don't want to decrease that so much because it's going to make me look like a fool, or it's going to create volatilities in financial market. I don't want to do it. So I'm going to try to do a bit less. In which case, all the same mechanism would occur, and you would have inflation expectation falling, because it's still the case that if you do less interest rate cuts, then inflation is going to fall below target. And in the end, you will end up in exactly the same situation in which, because you fall below target, you want to cut interest rates more. Even if you don't like volatility, if real inflation is falling, you're going to be willing to do more. And the same dynamic is going to kick in.
But is it going to be worse, or is it going to be better than like otherwise? That you didn't care about it.
So the more you care about stabilizing the interest rates, the more the mechanism is going to be there.
Okay.
So if you have lots of reason of attenuating changes in real interest rate, you will have a stronger cautiousness bias.
Thank you. So if there are no more questions,
Hi, Stefan.
I have one.
Go ahead.
Yes. Again, Stefan, very, very interesting talk. I want to go back to my original question of the beginning on the information set, because what I understood from your answer is that there isn't an asymmetry in the information set that the bank and the private sector has, but it does seem to me that there is in the end, because the bank does have uncertainty on sigma, but the private sector doesn't. The private sector knows the right parameter, right? I wonder if you have explored, or you think to explore in the future, what would happen if the private sector would also have uncertainty on this parameter, and maybe even higher uncertainty than what the central bank has. In fact, I would argue that this is a more realistic case than what you have. This would go in line with this informational channel of monetary policy, by which the central bank might have information that the public doesn't have. Why? We don't really know why, because we spend way much resources than the market does in understanding the state of the economy, etc. So there's still a puzzle as to why there is this information channel, but it seems to be there, right? By the work of Karadi and others. So yeah, I would argue that this is actually in favor of the private sector being uncertain, even more uncertain about where this parameter is, and trying to infer it from the actions of the central bank. So I think it's important to test this, whether this result holds or is robust to this level of uncertainty. And in fact, just to wrap up, the episodes of heavy use of unconventional policies are precisely instances where it's plausible to think that the private sector has much more uncertainty on where the state of the economy is, right? And where there is the transmission channel of monetary policy. So by you as a central bank acting more firmly, you reduce that uncertainty.
Absolutely. So yeah, many thanks for your comment. That's very useful. That's something. So we haven't done it. That was the reason I was cautious in telling you. Our understanding of the mechanism is that it does not depend on this asymmetry of information. But I definitely agree with you that there's no reason to. I mean, the only reason why we make this assumption that the central bank has more uncertainty is because it's more convenient. You can just took the equations directly off the shelf of a standard model. If I want, I mean, I would be definitely on your view that if I need to make a guess, the central bank knows more. That's why we are here in central banks to understand the mechanism of the economy. My point was just that the way I understand the mechanism, it wouldn't change it because it's not related to this asymmetry between the two. So even if there is no asymmetry, or even if the central bank knows more, this mechanism is going to be there as well. So we could do it. It would just make it more complicated because we would lose the standard expression of the Phillips curve and of the Euler equation. But it's my sense of it, but I'm hand waving obviously, is that just those amended equation would not change this mechanism, because the mechanism is not related to an asymmetry. It's just related to the central bank facing some uncertainty, regardless of whether it is facing more or less than the private sector. But that's, I mean, you're absolutely right that that's an important point, and something that would be useful to look more into details.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Andres.
I think Benjamin had a question, but maybe.
Yeah, just a little question. I mean, a bit regarding what Andres was just saying. Could be like a testable thing? I mean, would you expect, for example, that if the central bank has a small policy change, the expectation of inflation from consumers or whoever answered the should have more dispersion, and if the movement is bigger, there should be a contraction of the dispersion of the inflation expectation, something like that? In the sense that a central bank that moves fast should decrease the volatility of expected inflation, right? That should be one of the outcomes of this model. That if a central bank moves slowly, the volatility of expected inflation should increase, or you shouldn't expect that from your model.
So you're right, although you're absolutely right that there's a problem. I mean, in testing it, we mechanically run into a couple of issues, especially that so inflation volatility would increases in the face of this bias, but it doesn't necessarily mean that inflation expectation of consumers, firms, etc., change very quickly. When we think volatile, we tend to think, well, it moves all the time, but it can be a very slow-moving mechanism. So, for instance, the motivation for this paper is the euro area, in which the situation was the ECB seemed to took a lot of time to take action against falling inflation expectations. So, if you look at lower inflation expectations in the data, it's there. If you look at least at survey of professional forecasters, you would have these departures of inflation from the target. It's not a very high frequency, fast moving mechanism, but you see this departure of long-term expectation from target. So this is this stylus fact from the data that motivated this paper. And this, you can find it in the data. There might be other reason, etc. That's one possible mechanism, but that's the kind of thing that we are trying to reproduce.
Yeah. I was also thinking about the dispersion within the answers. If it contrasts, everybody agrees more if the central bank start to move faster, then and if it's moved slower, like there's higher disagreement. That could be a proxy of the volatility of the expectations.
Right. You're right. That's an interesting point. With all the, with the usual caveats of the mapping between dispersion and uncertainty. But that's that's right. That's something we could look into as a proxy on the empirical side. Thanks. Many thanks.
Okay, so thank you very much, Stephane, for coming here and speaking to us about this. It's a very important topic for us, of course. And thank you everybody to be here as well, and stay tuned for the next webinar of the Central Bank. I'm gonna stop recording now.